Uh, Not much. I just have a project that I have to do where I have to interview someone that's 2 generations older than I am.
Okay.
About a story from their past.
Okay.
And you like the stories about the integration stuff.
Okay. I got that. I don't know whether you want to ask me questions or whether you just want to hear me tell what I remember.
I'd rather listen, and then if I have clarifying questions, then I can ask them.
Okay. Well, back in, and we're talking about in the period of about 1968 up to about 1974, okay? I had occasion to integrate 2 different plants. One of them was a small plant in North Kansas City, Missouri. It was a paper mill, and at that time, during the 60s, was a real turbulent time, particularly with the racial things. You may have heard of Bull Connors down in Alabama turning the dogs loose on the black people as they were trying to march for voting rights. There was a big thing going on then, and we had just lost a president that had been assassinated, and his brother then was assassinated, and Martin Luther King was assassinated. So there was a lot of turmoil and pressure going on at the time as far as the black community was concerned. And so they passed a voting rights legislation in there, and I don't recall the years, and I didn't do any research for this conversation. But anyway, they came around that there was a real push to integrate the plants with black people, because particularly in the area that I was in, there was a very subtle discrimination. You didn't hire black people, and in Kansas City, that's where I was living at the time. And the idea was that the blacks had their area of town and the whites had their area of town, and the whites didn't go into the blacks and the blacks didn't go into the whites. But other than that, everyone was very congenial with each other. And if you met a black person on the street, you were courteous to them, and if they met you, they were courteous to you. And there just wasn't any real pressure. Just things had gone on for so long, they were just kind of as they were. Just everyone was kind of comfortable with the arrangement. I'm sure the black people didn't like it real well, but they weren't too vocal about it, at least in front of white people. They had a movie house that was for blacks, and the white people didn't go in that, and the blacks didn't go into the white people's movie houses. So anyway, there was starting to be a lot of pressure to integrate companies, and I worked for US Gypsum at the time, and it was an old, stodgy corporation, and my boss at the time in Kansas City was from Georgia, and I mean, he was a pure Georgian, and he had the attitude of what black people were, like you might very well expect the old school people. And I was kind of on the other side of the fence. I saw the racial discrimination for what it was, and I really was opposed to it. Although I wasn't the guy to go out and march on the streets or anything like that. So they were trying to figure out what they were going to do, and a lot of the talk was, can you believe that they're doing this, and can you believe that, and the company wants this, and so finally I went to him and I told the plant manager, I said, if you want this plant integrated, I'll integrate it for you. And he said, you do that? I said, yeah. And of course, I'd spent a lot of time in the South, so I knew how the South people talked and thought. So I was able to get him talked into it, and so we set about to hire. And the fellows that worked at the plant were not real happy about that, I got to tell you. And in fact, expression that you were called, if you were a white person and you were called this expression, this was worse than anything you could call it. They said, "You're nothing but a whoa," you know. And they couldn't have said anything in the white community that could have been worse, you know. And I answered him. I said, "No, I'm not. I just love everybody." And so proceeded to integrate the plan, and I did some interviews and hired some people, and what was kind of tough was because the black people, the black community, had not had these industrial level type jobs. They didn't bring any credentials with them when they came to apply for a job. You know, well, I worked as a janitor here for 3 months or 6 months or whatever it was, and they all had minimal jobs. So it was kind of hard to kind of sort through the qualifications. But anyway, I ended up I selected a candidate and was going to have him report for work. So the day before he was going to report, they came to me in a group. Now the plant was non-union, so didn't have to deal with that. They came and they said, "We're not going to come in here with any." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And they said, "We're just going to stand at the fence. You're going to have to run the plant with him and yourself." And I said, "That's okay." I said, "If you don't come in, then you'll be fired." And I said, "So then that'll just make a lot more jobs available for his friends." Man, did that go over like a time bomb. So the next morning they were all in there, but they were grumbling and they were fussy, and I got to tell you, I was not a happy person. Very few of the employees wanted to talk to me, and if I went by and said hi to them, they wouldn't answer me.
Were you a manager then?
Yeah, I was a production manager.
Okay.
I was a paper mill superintendent, yeah. And I had about 100 employees working under me. And so as it turned out, the humorous part of this, well, the ironic part, is this guy that I hired wasn't worth anything. I mean, he was absolutely clueless of what was going on, and just had no concept of work or punching the time clock or anything like that. It was a total disaster. I don't think that if I'd have searched for a less qualified candidate, I could have found him. And so within a short period of time, within just about a week, he was under a probationary period. I terminated him. Well, now, man, did that shock the people on the production people, the people on the floor. And they said, "You got rid of that guy." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "He wasn't qualified." And almost at that point, their attitude towards me changed because they realized I was being fair. In other words, I did not hire that guy just because he was black. I hired the guy because he could do a job, and he couldn't do it. He was gone. And then I subsequently hired other black employees when I had opportunities, and occasionally I would have to let them go under the probationary period. The white people, sometimes I'd hire them. They wouldn't make it under the probationary period. So eventually it kind of all smoothed out. And by the time I left that plant in 1973 or 74, we were all friends again, and we had some black employees, and they had proved themselves as being capable, just like the white guys. But the pressure was racial pressure. The attitude was that in those days, and it sounds kind of silly to say it today, but the attitude in those days was just generally that black people just weren't as smart as white people. And I don't know where that idea ever came from. And when I went to college at Northwestern my freshman year, I got thrown in engineering school. I got thrown into some classes with some black college students, and I realized pretty damn quick, boy, they're as smart as I am. In fact, not smarter. So that argument was just completely brushed right out of my mind. not that I carried it, but I really didn't have any thought at that time about blacks and whites and the racial component. It was just oblivious. I was just having too good of a time living and going on, and I wasn't carrying the morality of it and worried about it. That was as a kid and as a student and as growing up. But by the time I got to where I was able to have an impact, by that time I was very much in favor of not only integration but just seeing, they're Americans, they're fellow Americans. Just because their skin is brown, that doesn't make anything. You stick them with a knife, they're going to bleed the same red I'm going to bleed. So I just kind of saw the idiocy of this racism.
Was it affirmative action to hire black people back then?
Yeah, there was being tossed around a lot, and but I don't think that our company had ascribed to that. It hadn't become a policy of the corporation at that time. Now, in that same corporation in Chicago had black people working for them, and in the East Coast in plants like the one I eventually ended up in Clark, New Jersey. They already had black employees, but their hiring practices tended to conform to the community in which they were in, if that makes any sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's kind of the story there. It all finally went down, and then I was transferred to New Jersey. That was 1973, I believe. Might have been 1974. Forget kind of which year. And so by that time, there was beginning to build pressure for women to be integrated into the plants, and that's an entirely different story. The black integration, that was a racial thing, and for the women, that was not racial. That was more of a sociological thing, or I guess you'd call it. I'm having a little trouble looking for a word here in my mind. Sexist. I guess it was a sexist thing. So the two weren't really corresponding to each other. They were entirely two different battlefields, if you will. And what had happened is that during the basic outlook of society back around the time World War II broke out, was that the men were the breadwinner and the women made the home. And that meant that she cooked, and she had the children, and she did not have a job outside the home. That was the husband's responsibility. Excuse me. In fact, that was even factored into the Social Security when it was created. I believe that was they started taking withholdings for Social Security back in about 1936, and no payments were made until 1940. But anyway, they even allowed that the woman would be entitled to Social Security based off of what her husband had earned. So in other words, the husband would get his full Social Security, and a wife then would get an additional payment, which was about, I think, something in the neighborhood of 60% of what her husband got. So a married man with a family and a wife was, in essence, going to end up with two paychecks in recognition of the wife's contribution to the family. Then World War II broke out, and because of the fact that our friend Hitler, that guy decided after Pearl Harbor, within about a week, he declared war on us, and here we are as a nation stuck fighting two different wars halfway around the world from each other. And so they really had to, it drafted a lot of people. Every man that could move was either volunteered or was drafted into the service. And so the women had to step up and fill the jobs that were vacated by the men. And it turned out they did an excellent job. They did their jobs well, and they were able to operate equipment, machineries, and all that good stuff. And so after World War II was over and the soldiers came back and reclaimed their jobs, the women were saying, well, wait a minute. We want a job too, and you've just kicked us out of our jobs. And so it kind of began the movement towards women taking the manufacturing industrial type jobs. And so there was a lot of pressure for that. And at that time, women that worked were not normally paid the same amount as a man right next to them. I mean, they could be working together, and there was different pay. The woman's job, the concept was, well, a woman is really the supplementary income for the family. The husband gets the big job, and the wife's job is the supplementary job. So we don't really have to pay her as much, even if she's doing the same amount of work. And Clay, your Ning ran into that when she went to work at Hallmark Cars, because she had a job that was a supervisory job, and a man that did the same type of supervisory job that she did was paid substantially more than what she was getting paid. And the idea was, well, but he's got a family and you don't have a family to support, because Ning didn't have a family to support because she had a husband to support her. Of course, her husband was going to college and didn't have any income, but that's still the way the argument went.
Where was that? Where did she work?
Huh?
Where did she work?
Hallmark Greeting Cards there in Kansas City. That was their corporate headquarters there.
Okay.
So anyway, they were trying to decide how they were going to get women into the plant, and if it could be done or not, and there was a lot of internal resistance against that. And I stepped up again, because I'm not scared. I stepped up. I said, you want to bring women into the plant? I said, I'll do it. So I had a larger production department there, and so we started to bring the women in. And we're kind of confronted with a different mentality there. The women just did. You and I, we've been shooting guns, and we know what a big bang is, and we've ridden in cars that had, in my day, we had mufflers that were real noisy, and so guys just used to being around equipment, the lathe, and the dad had a lathe in the garage or something, or a saw down in the basement, and women just weren't exposed to that like us guys were. So I'm using the we as the whatever that we is, imperial. No, anyway, they were reluctant when they came in. They were overwhelmed by just the visual parts of what they were seeing. Great big cranes, lift trucks, conveyor belts, big ovens, and things like that. And they were quite scared. And so the hardest part that I had in getting women to bring themselves into the flow of things was to give them the encouragement that they could do it, and to try to alleviate their fears. And so, I was real careful not to just push people right into the thing right away. And again, I had some problems where I had to hire some and then have to let them go. And so, I think I was fairly fair. I'd like to think I was. And I had a couple of women that really turned out that were just, man, I just knocked the ball right out of the park. And it was kind of funny, a little side story. I had this one woman that had, she was about my age. At the time I was about 40, and she was about 40. And all her life she had been a waitress working in a restaurant for tips. And so she got this job. She got insurance, she got holidays, she got vacation, she got, just like she'd fallen in a pot of gold. And then the regular pay, and the pay itself was more than what she was making as a waitress. And so one day I heard her with a couple of guys in the lunchroom. They were sitting there talking, and the two guys were really moaning and groaning about what a lousy job they had at this place that they worked, meaning, our factory. What a crummy place it was. It was sure blah, 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 and then they go on like that. And finally, this gal looked right at him. She said, you know what? She said, I'll tell you what you do. She said, you get the hell out of here, and you go down there to that restaurant that I just left. They got a vacancy. You can have that job, and send the other waitress up here. She'll want this job up here. And of course, they looked at her, and they realized what she was telling them. I've just left a job when I was making minimum wage, and now I'm making a fairly good salary to support my family, had benefits, and all that. So, and in fact, that's the same woman one time that when they were having some problems on the paper machine, she had progressed her way up through the ranks, and was just the next highest level would have been a machine tender, and she had reached that level. And the guy that was the machine tender on her shift, one day they were having a bad day, and they'd had a lot of paper breaks, which is it stops production. You got to stop and pick up the paper that's been put on the floor. Now, we're not talking about, a couple reams of paper. We're talking about maybe half a ton of paper, wet paper that's been left on the floor that you have to go get and drag it out of the way. And she went up to, after about the third or fourth paper break, she goes up to that machine tender. She said, you put that damn thing on the ground on the floor one more time. She said, I'm coming up here and taking this job myself. And, I admired her, but the women, they would try to finesse things a little bit. When they were scared, they'd come up with an excuse for why they couldn't do the job if you were trying to promote them. That was the hardest thing, is moving them ahead one position. Because whenever you take on to a new job, there's a certain amount of hesitancy and reluctance and kind of concern whether you could do it, and it really looks terrible. And it's like, after you do the job the first week, you think, geez, why did I ever worry about this? One of the things that, and this is real life. One of the gals came to me one time, and I told her I wanted to promote her up to a back tender, and she said, "Oh, I don't think I can do that job." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And she said, "Well," she said, "we have an attendance policy here," and she said, "when I have my monthly," she said, "I couldn't come to work to do that job because it wouldn't work, if I wasn't feeling good. And then if I took off every month, then after a while you'd get rid of me for bad attendance. So I can't take that promotion." And I said, "You know what? I said, I want you to think about this." I said, sometimes the other guys come in and they're so hungover after a payday that you got to do their work for them. She said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, maybe on those days when you're not feeling all that good and just think that one particular part of your job you might not be able to do," I said, "maybe the guys would, as a team member for you, would cover that little bit." I said, "Why don't you try it and just see if they'll help you there?" And she looked at me and she knew that I'd erased her excuse. And she said, "All right, I'll try it." And so she went on and successfully did the job. But you had to just kind of know kind of where they were coming from. And I don't mean that as a derogatory. Anyway, it all worked out well. And when I left the plant, I probably had maybe 10% women. That doesn't sound like very much, but when you go from 0 to 10, That's a very significant change. And had I been there longer, it might have been even more. So that's about all I had to tell you about that. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to help you.
What were the years for the different places, the integration?
Well, the one I did in Kansas City, which was for the African Americans, was in the late 60s, and shortly after that I got transferred to the East Coast, and so the bringing the women on board, that was in the early to mid 70s.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I have.